Present us, O Lord, in all our doings with thy most gracious favor, and further us with thy continued help, that in all our works begun, continued, and ended in thee, we may glorify thy holy name, and finally, by thy mercy, attain everlasting life. Amen. Before proceedings begin, I want to address the concern I have about the member's statement presented by the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre on Friday, April 30th, 2021. I have had time since Friday to read the transcript of the statement found on page 700 of Hanchard and to consider its context. The statement was about seals. Most of what the member said would have been fine if the intent was to generally speak about seals. I remind members that the speaker not only takes into account the word spoken, but also the tone, manner, and intention of the word spoken. Context is also important, as being noted by previous speakers. There is a direct link between the member's statement and off-the-record comment made by the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre during proceedings on April 29th. On that date, the comment apologized to the seals was attributed to the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre in reference to the government members. These words were, in fact, the subject of a point of order that were subsequently referred to by the opposition House Leader, even though they were not on the record. In addressing the point of order, I made the simple request that members be careful as to how they characterize other members. So what happens the very next day? The member from Regina Elphinstone Centre decides to speak about seals. Moreover, in doing so, she drew a direct behavioral comparison to one of the government members. I think the intention was clear. The member used the guise of a literary device to disguise her characterization of government members. This is not the first time a member has tried to use metaphoric examples and allegory to portray other members. It is also not the first time a member has directly or indirectly represented other members as having the characteristics of certain animals. All this had been ruled out of order in the past. Personal insults, regardless of how they are disguised, are simply out of order. The member for Regina Elphinstone Centre needs to be mindful that proceedings are supposed to be based on long-standing tradition of respect for the integrity of all members. Presenting petitions. I recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition to save the lighthouse and provide core funding to emergency homeless shelters. These citizens wish to bring to our attention that Saskatchewan is the only province in Canada that still uses per diem funding model, where emergency shelter for a person facing homelessness is provided only for social assistance recipients per bed per night. Other provinces use a block funding model where the shelter is funded by providing core funding and the shelter is open to anyone who needs it. The lighthouse serving the Battlefords was opened in 2015 to fill a need in the community for people facing homelessness, addictions, and mental health challenges. It faced a 90% cut of its core funding from the Government of Saskatchewan only 1 year after opening. This funding has never been restored. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to immediately provide stable, guaranteed core funding to the lighthouse serving the Battlefords, and to expand supports for emergency shelters across Saskatchewan by moving to a core funding model. This is signed by individuals from North Battleford, Mr. Speaker. I do so present.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to present a petition calling for the government to reject the proposed Lambert Peat Moss development. The signatories of this petition wish to bring the following information to our attention. That Quebec-based Lambert Peat Moss has proposed the creation of a peat moss mine near La Ronge in northern Saskatchewan. that many local residents, hunters and trappers and traditional land users are opposed to the proposed peat moss mine and are concerned about the potential for damages to habitats, including critical habitat for woodland caribou, trap lines and drinking water sources, as well as climate impacts. More than 20,000 people have signed an online petition calling for the proposed peat moss mine to be stopped. I'd like to read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the provincial government to protect the boreal forest and reject the proposed Lambert peat moss development. Mr. Speaker, the petition today is signed by residents of L'Orange. I so submit.
Recognize a member from Saskatoon University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to present a petition once again today calling for pay equity legislation. The signatories would like to bring to our attention the following points. The Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission has recommended proactive and comprehensive pay equity legislation, which has not been pursued by the Government of Saskatchewan. Experience with pay equity legislation in other jurisdictions shows that a major part of the wage gap between women and men is caused by discriminatory attitudes towards women. Where female-dominated and male-dominated jobs have been evaluated on the basis of objective criteria, women's wages have often risen considerably. I'll read the prayer. We, in the prayer that reads as follows, respectfully request that the Legislative Assembly of Saskatchewan call on the Government of Saskatchewan to introduce pay equity legislation. Mr. Speaker, the petition today has been signed by people from Saskatoon. I do so present.
Reading and receiving petitions. Statement by members. I recognize the member from Regina Lakeview.
I rise today in recognition of the Moose Jaw Transition House, a very important non-profit organization that offers 5 key program areas: shelter services, crisis line, community outreach program, children exposed to violence program, and shelter support and follow-up program. The services and programs that are delivered by Moose Jaw Transition House are guided by the values of acceptance, empowerment, respect, safety, support, and compassion. And they are indeed achieving the vision of providing safety for the present and empowerment for the future for so many vulnerable people fleeing situations of interpersonal violence. Recently, Moose Jaw Transition House was able to undertake a new initiative thanks to support from the United Way Emergency Community Support Fund to support children and families struggling with mental health during the pandemic. They came up with the great idea to provide families with COVID comfort kits free of charge. These kits contain activity items, crafts, and journals, along with advice and methods for parents to use to talk to their kids about mental health. They made up 70 kits, and all of them were spoken for within a day. I ask all members of this assembly to join me in showing appreciation for Moose Jaw Transition House and for this great idea and their commitment to supporting children and families in the community.
Recognize the member from Regina Walsh Acres.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I stand in the House today to recognize the 70th annual CMHA Mental Health Week. Mental illness affects people from all walks of life. In Canada, it affects 1 in 5 of us personally. We appreciate organizations like the Canadian Mental Health Association who work hard to raise awareness, decrease stigma, and advocate for those most affected. We know we need to do more, Mr. Speaker, and that is why our government is building on past investments. $396 million will be invested in mental health supports, making key investments in youth-focused initiatives, suicide prevention, and addressing the demand for services. Mr. Speaker, it's been a long year, and I ask that we all take the time this week to be kind to ourselves, take care of our mental health. Mr. Speaker, I want to emphasize the importance of reaching out for help. The theme of this year's Mental Health Week is to get real about how you feel and name it, don't numb it. Because, Mr. Speaker, voicing our emotions is so important for our mental health. Supports are available for all Saskatchewan residents, whether by phone, online, at walk-in clinics, or virtually. With that, Mr. Speaker, I ask all members to join me in doing their part to raise awareness for mental health and to get real about how they feel. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Centre.
Miigwech, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to discuss the issue of systemic racism in Saskatchewan. At a recent 75-minute debate, members opposite acknowledged and agreed that systemic racism exists within our province and systemic racism was inherited. We as legislators have the power to meaningfully address systemic racism within our government institutions and with our province. One way systemic racism manifests itself is when Indigenous and racialized peoples are treated differently than mainstream folks. For instance, when one of my constituents, an Indigenous single parent of 3 children, had COVID-19, she was told by public health officials to give up her children to social services until she recovers, while a non-Indigenous mother would be offered support by public health to arrange for supports such as food, etc., for her and her children. This is an example of differential treatment that perpetuates systemic racism. If we do not address this truth, we will continue to be stuck between the haves and the have-nots. I ask this government to get to work on ending systemic racism in our province, and I ask that this government review how systems like our government and institutions continue to perpetuate systemic racism. Miigwech.
Recognize the member from Kootenay-Turtleford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Kendra Weenie, an award-nominated author and inspirational speaker from Sweetgrass First Nation, was featured this year on International Women's Day by the Government of Saskatchewan Status of Women Office. Mr. Speaker, Miss Weenie grew up in a home where there was alcoholism. She doesn't remember her memories as being happy ones. She remembers feeling lonely. After graduating from University of Saskatchewan, Miss Weenie met someone and began dating. 5 months later, she became pregnant. By this time, Mr. Speaker, she was being controlled financially and was being emotionally abused. In 2013, Miss Weenie suffered a concussion and a brain injury due to domestic abuse. Miss Weenie now speaks to women all over Canada that are affected by trauma and leads self-healing workshops. In 2019, Miss Weenie published a book entitled Surviving Domestic Violence and began sharing her journey to healing. In December of 2020, Mr. Speaker, Miss Weenie was one of the recipients of CBC Saskatchewan's Future 40 Awards. Miss Weenie is a single mom to Kalea and is working towards publishing her second book. Mr. Speaker, I would now like to ask all members of this Assembly to join me in congratulating Miss Weenie on publishing her first book, Surviving Domestic Violence, and having the courage to speak out and tell her story to help others. Thank you.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon-Riversdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to inform the Assembly that earlier this April, the Government of Saskatchewan and its partners announced significant investment, one that will benefit the residents of our province's biggest city. This will come from our government's investment of more than $34.3 million in provincial funding to support 11 infrastructure projects in the Saskatoon area. These projects will benefit the community for years to come. The funding will be provided for upgrades to local water, wastewater infrastructure, and city sidewalk improvements. Also included are projects to improve the Meewasin Trail, the Sutherland Curling Club, and the Western Development Museum. All told, when the provincial investment is included with contributions from the federal government, the City of Saskatoon, and other partners, it represents a combined infrastructure investment of more than $100 million. This investment will help create jobs, strengthen important infrastructure, protect the economy, and build a better quality of life for all as we emerge from this pandemic. We are proud to do our part to keep Saskatchewan as strong as a resilient people who call this great province home. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Belleville-Saltcoats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. McNutt, Saskatchewan is a small village east of Yorkton, north of Langeburg, has a population of 65 people, and is the hometown of TSN's Darren Drager. The McNutt Community Centre has just installed a new $220,000 roof after decades of hockey, curling, and community functions. The centre was originally the project of a community fundraising and building effort in 1967 by the grandparents and great-grandparents of those responsible for renovating the facility today. They wanted to see the centre being built, and now it's our turn to keep it going, was a call to action by the local organizers. It is the hub and heart of the community and surrounding area. In the typical Saskatchewan can-do approach, the Rec Board hosted an 80s dance for the project last February, which ended up being the community's last hurrah before the pandemic hit. From there, fundraising efforts for the projects came in all aspects, from small fundraisers to corporate donations. Dragon's Den contestant Wendell Estates Honey had a donation reward program. People from Vancouver to Texas with roots or family ties back home heard about the project and pitched in. To do this, mostly during a pandemic, is in itself a major accomplishment. The initial fundraising started less than 2 years ago, and now the roof reconstruction phase has been completed by Pine Ridge Construction from nearby Bredenbury. Mr. Speaker, I now ask all members in joining me on congratulating and thanking the McNutt Committee on a great fundraising effort and a job well done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear. Recognize the member from Moose Jaw North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. More than 450,000 doses of the COVID vaccine have now gone into arms in Saskatchewan. More than 400,000 Saskatchewan residents have received their first dose. That's 43% of our adult population, Mr. Speaker. Our vaccination rollout continues to lead the country. Uptake continues to be extremely high. 75% of everyone aged 50 and older have now gotten their first shot. And we continue to see huge interest at our drive-through clinics throughout the province, as witnessed in Moose Jaw and Regina this past weekend. Mr. Speaker, I got my first shot at the Regina drive-through yesterday, and I want to personally thank everyone there for the great job they are doing. Saskatchewan is now receiving more vaccines and vaccinating more people at more locations. Many of our pharmacies are now doing vaccinations. Once again, our government wants to say thank you to all the healthcare workers and support staff who are vaccinating thousands of people in this province every day. And thank you to everyone in Saskatchewan who are doing their part by making an appointment or lining up at a drive-through and getting their shot. Together, we are making Saskatchewan a safer place, Mr. Speaker. The road back to normal runs through a vaccination clinic, and every day we travel further down that road, closer to our destination. So thank you, Saskatchewan. Let's all keep doing our part. Keep following the public health orders, and when it's your turn, roll up your sleeve and stick it to COVID. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Question period. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, we're all looking forward to when we can get rid of the plexiglass, have seatmates again, take our masks off. The minister doesn't want a seatmate, apparently, but we're looking forward to that. But not this session. It never made sense to be removing our masks to speak in this chamber this session. No good reason has ever been given for that behavior. And it makes even less sense now that the WHO has officially recognized that COVID-19 is aerosolized and airborne. We have a case from someone here in the legislature, Mr. Speaker, and there's no cameras now to show our faces. So to the Premier, is he going to continue to pander to anti-maskers? Will he and his members continue to take their masks off to speak, or will he act responsibly for once?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I will continue to do, I would say quite strongly, is represent the people of this province, Mr. Speaker, and make the very best decisions as a government, on behalf of the people that we represent across Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. That includes, at times, yes, over the course of the past year, bringing in various public health measures, asking the people of Saskatchewan to follow those measures, Mr. Speaker, enforcing that from time to time, as we've seen, Mr. Speaker, but it also involves making decisions with our Saskatchewan Health Authority, private suppliers like our pharmacies and others, the Saskatoon Tribal Council, our Indigenous Services Canada, Mr. Speaker, and all of our Indigenous communities, to ensure that we are making vaccines accessible to all of the people of the province. As a member from Moose Jaw North, who received his vaccine this weekend, had said in his statement, All roads through this pandemic do lead through one of Saskatchewan's vaccination centres, and we are making sure that we are making those vaccines available. We're leading the nation in the vaccine rollout, Mr. Speaker, and that ultimately is going to lead us in the weeks ahead to the opportunity for everyone to have access to one of those vaccines, ultimately at some point this summer for all of us then to take all of our masks off.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Embarrassing lack of leadership, Mr. Speaker. We're all excited about seeing people get their vaccines. We want everyone to get that shot as soon as they can. But 24 people died in this province in the last 8 days. We're barreling towards 500 people having lost their lives to COVID-19 in Saskatchewan. Is that this Premier's idea of a strong performance?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as I've said in this House on many occasions, Mr. Speaker, like many leaders have across this nation, across North America and around the world, Mr. Speaker, every death, Mr. Speaker, whether it be to COVID or whatever that may be, Mr. Speaker, every inopportune death most certainly is a tragedy, Mr. Speaker, and we've said it many times that our hearts are with all of those families that have struggled through the loss of a loved one through this last 14 months now with the COVID pandemic. Mr. Speaker, what I would state is strong leadership by this government in this province, and by in particularly the health minister, Mr. Speaker, is the vaccine rollout that we are putting forward on behalf of the people of the province. We're now at 34% of our entire population has received their first dose. Mr. Speaker, 43% of all of those that are eligible have received their first dose, and 75% of all of those over 50 years of age, Mr. Speaker, have received their first dose in this province. Mr. Speaker, when we look around the world at Israel, the UK, even the United States of America, Mr. Speaker, all of those communities, states, provinces, countries are now moving their way through reopening stages after their pandemic. And what do those three countries in particular have in common? High vaccinations rates, Mr. Speaker, 45, 50, 55% of their entire population, Mr. Speaker. That's the road we're on. We're going to get there very soon.
Yeah. Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those sympathies ring hollow when this Premier refused to do the work to keep people safe. We've had the highest death rates in the country in 2021, and our GDP has dropped by 5.2% since last year, among the highest in the country. We've lost 23,000 jobs in Saskatchewan since last year, the highest per capita job loss in the country, much worse than Atlantic Canada, where they did the work to keep people safe from COVID-19 and protect their economy. Mr. Speaker, is this economic failure this Premier's idea of a strong performance?
Recognize the Premier.
This is quite a question, Mr. Speaker, in light of just coming a week after three of some of the largest investments in the agri-food industry that this province has ever seen. Three investments by Richardson, Mr. Speaker, by Cargill and by Viterra, well-known Saskatchewan agri-food companies, Mr. Speaker, put forward literally billions of dollars to invest right here in this province, Mr. Speaker, essentially doubling our crush capacity, making Saskatchewan the canola crush capital of the world. Mr. Speaker, creating not only construction jobs in the community of Yorkton, Regina and the surrounding areas, but creating jobs, Mr. Speaker, that will go on years and years into the future, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we are very thankful for what Saskatchewan people have provided in the way of opportunity for these investments to be made. Mr. Speaker, we have a leading the nation vaccination plan in place so that we can ensure that we can get back to the days of growth and prosperity in this province, Mr. Speaker, days that we got used to over the course of the last 14 years in this province, Mr. Speaker, days that we didn't have for the 16 years previous to that under the NDP.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Despite a decade of warnings about the terrible situation in long-term care in Saskatchewan, despite deadly outbreaks across the country in long-term care, this Premier stood up in the fall and he boasted, these outbreaks haven't happened here. And then he went on to do absolutely nothing to protect the seniors in Saskatchewan's long-term care. And what happened as a result? Over 100 people died in long-term care homes in Saskatchewan, 41 in Parkside Extended Care alone. Is that the Premier's idea of a strong performance?
I recognize the Minister of Rural and Remote Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We take this issue very seriously, and recognize the tragedy that happened at Parkside Extendicare, Mr. Speaker. It's why we've referred this issue to the Ombudsman to do a thorough investigation as to what happened, specifically at Parkside Extendicare. Mr. Speaker, there was a number of supports put in place, not just at Parkside, and the members of this House will know what some of those supports have been, just based on some of the earlier conversations we've had in this House, Mr. Speaker, whether it was assistance with PPE fit testing and providing boots on the ground, having additional supports, physicians to go through and help with that, and providing supports wherever requested by whether it was Extendicare or any of our facilities in this province, Mr. Speaker. That's why we've taken the steps we have to protect the senior citizens in our long-term care homes in order to have the restrictions in place to keep them safe, and also to make sure that we got those residents vaccinated as quickly as we could, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
So I guess the short answer is no, Mr. Speaker. It's an incredibly weak performance. Weaker still that this Premier has no insight into the way he's failed Saskatchewan. Weaker still that he stays seated when asked about his fatal errors, Mr. Speaker. Weakness all around. Instead, he wants to gaslight Saskatchewan people. He wants to spin and pretend that things are going well. Ask them to deny the damage that they can see with their own eyes, Mr. Speaker. As of last count, over 30,000 people were waiting for surgeries here in Saskatchewan. That's as of December 31st, before the third wave. Resulted in overwhelmed hospitals and ICUs, more slowdowns, more cancellations. Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, he will have a COVID-19 update tomorrow. Will he release updated information on healthcare wait lists and updated modeling on what's about to happen with COVID-19?
I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And since the beginning of this pandemic, we've always tried to maintain a very fine balance of maintaining our healthcare system and protecting our healthcare system while dealing with the pandemic, Mr. Speaker. And I want to thank all of the frontline workers who have been very nimble in being able to adapt to changing circumstances, doing jobs that they hadn't done before, Mr. Speaker, such as contact tracing and a mass vaccination of a very complicated vaccine, Mr. Speaker, across the province. Mr. Speaker, our surgeries, we are working on this, Mr. Speaker, but we have to make sure that we are continuing to find that fine balance, Mr. Speaker, of making sure that we have the most people vaccinated, because that is what is going to get through this pandemic, so we can return back to normal, and not just normal in our economy, not just normal in our lifestyles, Mr. Speaker, but normal in our healthcare system, so we can get those surgeries, get the people that need their surgeries as fast as we possibly can, get them recovered, and then get them back to normal. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, Saskatchewan people are not okay with the rise of anti-mask rallies all across our province. These idiotic demonstrations are putting lives at risk and are making COVID-19 worse. That's why I brought an amendment to committee on Saturday. That amendment would have made a new offence for organizing a demonstration that violates the public health order, and with fines starting at $10,000. Sadly, government members voted it down. Why doesn't the Sask Party want to increase the fines for organizing these anti-mask, pro-COVID rallies that are putting us all at risk?
Recognize the Minister of Justice and Attorney General.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker, we have a full slate, full suite of remedies, Mr. Speaker, penalties that can be used by law enforcement to enforce the laws of this province, Mr. Speaker, under the Public Health Act and under the amendments that this government has brought forward under the Emergencies Act, Mr. Speaker. As I explained to the member yesterday, or in committee on Saturday, certainly provisions of the criminal code which are picked up by provisions within the Summary Offences Procedures Act gives police and law enforcement a wide range of tools to be able to enforce our public health orders, Mr. Speaker. We know that law enforcement is aware of what their remedies and what their tools are to keep the public, to keep us safe, Mr. Speaker. We encourage people to continue to comply with the public health orders, Mr. Speaker, how important that is, and making sure that people get out and get their vaccines, Mr. Speaker. This is the way we're going to get through the pandemic.
Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, it's clear that the existing fines aren't providing a deterrence, and the minister's bill, while raising the maximum fines that can be levied against people breaking the rules, doesn't set a minimum. Anti-mask, pro-COVID protesters are literally wearing this minister's $2,800 fines as badges of honor at their rallies. Does he really believe the status quo, $2,800 fines, are providing effective deterrence? And if not, why not support our motion to fine the organizers $10,000?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, under the Public Health Act, Mr. Speaker, the maximum fine for an individual is $75,000, Mr. Speaker. We have significant penalties that are available, Mr. Speaker, for law enforcement to be able to enforce the penalties not only under the Public Health Act, but under the Emergencies Act and under the Public Health Order, Mr. Speaker. We think that adding another penalty within the legislation, Mr. Speaker, given all the remedies that are available, all the penalties that are available, would have been redundant, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, the penalties are available for law enforcement to be able to ensure that the public is safe, that they can enforce the public health orders, Mr. Speaker. We continue to encourage people in this province to comply with the public health orders, Mr. Speaker. That's how we're going to get through this pandemic.
Recognize the member from Regina Douglas Park.
Mr. Speaker, it's clear that we need a minimum fine, not a maximum fine, and that's what the government does not support. Mr. Speaker, this government has failed throughout this pandemic to send the right signals when it comes to following the public health orders. With variants on the rise and our health system at a breaking point, these rallies aren't just stupid, they're dangerous. ICUs are double bunking patients, and treatments for brain cancer are being postponed indefinitely because of this government's failure to control the pandemic. Rallies that can spread COVID-19 to dozens or even hundreds of people put everyone at risk. SAS party members had the opportunity to send a message on Saturday that protest organizers will face serious consequences for breaking the law. They chose not to. Is it because the minister actually has a plan to increase penalties for breaking the rules? Or is the minister worried that might send the wrong message to his party's buffalo wing?
Recognize the Minister of Justice.
Speaker, I would have expected better from the member opposite, Mr. Speaker. There are significant fines, including $75,000, Mr. Speaker, under the Public Health Act. The legislation, which went in committee on Saturday, increases the maximum fine to $7,500 under the Emergencies Act, Mr. Speaker, but that does not displace the penalties that are available for law enforcement to impose with respect to offences under the Public Health Act, Mr. Speaker, including the Public Health Order, Mr. Speaker. We have great faith in law enforcement in this province to continue to enforce the laws of this province, to make sure that we all continue to be safe, Mr. Speaker. We encourage them to continue to do that, Mr. Speaker, and we encourage people to continue to comply with the provisions of the Public Health Order, Mr. Speaker. We have all the faith in the world, Mr. Speaker, in our law enforcement officers to ensure that the law is enforced to the maximum extent, Mr. Speaker, and they're going to continue to do that.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Jobs Minister is playing politics with the economy. On Thursday and Friday, I asked for details about extending the Small Business Emergency Payment Program, and the minister didn't answer and chose to waste time with political smears so pathetically repetitious that the minister had to be reminded to stay on topic. Now, Mr. Speaker, small business owners were relegated to the 3 p.m. Friday news dump just to get a reheated and unresponsive program. Now, Mr. Speaker, the minister seems scared to say anything in front of the press gallery and the opposition, preferring to govern by news release. But, Mr. Speaker, if small businesses are a priority, why does the worst in the country Jobs Minister punt this announcement to a Friday afternoon news release?
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Export Development.
Well, appreciate the detailed process question there, Mr. Speaker, but the reality is that small business owners have been well supported by this government through the entire pandemic. In fact, Mr. Speaker, we're the first in the country to go out with a comprehensive program of support for small business, a program that was copied, replicated across the country because it has been very successful, Mr. Speaker, in supporting those small businesses who have done in a challenging time as well as could be expected, Mr. Speaker. I can tell you as well what those small businesses don't want. They don't want to be shut down, Mr. Speaker, which has been the approach and the demand of those members opposite for months and months and months. Mr. Speaker, small businesses have shown that they can operate responsibly and safely through this pandemic, and they have done so. Mr. Speaker, those members want to shut them down. We want to see them continue to operate.
Recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to quote the bard, methinks he doth protest too much. Although the minister will not acknowledge as much here in the House, Mr. Speaker, it's good to know he recognizes how bad his pandemic response is. And I quote, many Saskatchewan small businesses continue to be affected by the restrictions due to the pandemic. Now, Mr. Speaker, he'll say it in a Friday afternoon press release, but I guess he's too proud or probably too scared to show contrition in the Assembly. But, Mr. Speaker, while he feverishly thumbed through election returns, small business owners across the province were left in the lurch by the Jobs Minister until 0 hour. Now, either this minister literally has no plan, is playing politics at the expense of small businesses, or, the most likely scenario, both. So what is it, Mr. Speaker? Is he flying by the seat of his pants, or does it just look that way?
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Export Development.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And it's been an honor to work as closely as we have with the small business owners across this province, Mr. Speaker, over the course of the last year specifically, but over the last 14 years that we've had the honor of being in government, to create an environment where businesses have been able to grow, make investments. And Mr. Speaker, we've seen that reflected just in the course of the last couple of weeks here, with record investments that have been made into this province because companies and businesses have had the ability and the certainty and the confidence to make literally billions of dollars of announcements for the long term, Mr. Speaker. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because there are conditions that there is a comfort level with in making those huge investments, something that we know, Mr. Speaker, never happened under the members opposite.
I recognize the member from Regina University.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate today's performative show of gravitas. But, Mr. Speaker, the Jobs Minister this session has spent more time talking about either the private sector or the NDP than he has spent talking about his own party. And, Mr. Speaker, when you're in government, that's a sign you're losing. So if the minister was actually interested in doing his job, he could actually start by listening, like I have, to small business owners and employees who know that last Friday's sad fanfare doesn't do nearly enough. The minister was gleeful, and I quote, I think small businesses are going to be quite pleased. But, Mr. Speaker, this is the same level of support businesses saw before the Sass party shut them down over a month ago. The public health orders have closed many restaurants, but the supports haven't increased one thin dime. Folks that were banking on making up their losses during a busy spring and summer season are now worried about losing everything. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister do the right thing and get it right for restaurants?
Recognize the Minister of Trade and Export Development.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the hypocrisy of the Leader of the Opposition is stunning. These members need to pick a lane. On the one hand, the Leader of the Opposition stands up day after day after day demanding a complete lockdown, demanding these businesses be shut down immediately, tens of thousands of workers be unemployed immediately. And we know, Mr. Speaker, if he had ever had that opportunity, he would have shut them down months ago and kept them shut down for months, Mr. Speaker. We have worked very hard because we know small businesses can operate safely and responsibly. They don't trust them. We do, Mr. Speaker, and they have operated safely and responsibly. And if we want to talk about records, Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to do that. Over the course of the last 14 years that we have been in government, do you know how large, Mr. Speaker, the increase in private sector investment has been over their time in government? 50%.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, since taking over as Minister for Seniors in November, this minister has had to answer for more than a decade of inaction in addressing chronic issues in long-term care. But thankfully, the characters responsible are still kicking around, and in fact, they share the front benches of this government today. Can the Minister for Government Relations, who used to be the Health Minister, explain why he failed to act on a 2010 report authored by the current Minister for Parks, a report that called for the creation of a Seniors Secretariat within the Ministry of Health? Why wasn't this independent office created? And does he agree that it's needed now more than ever?
I recognize the Minister of Seniors.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government has taken this issue very seriously, Mr. Speaker. It's why we now have a ministry responsible for mental health and addictions, but also for seniors in rural and remote care, health care, Mr. Speaker. There's a number of improvements that we have made across this province for seniors and for older adults in Saskatchewan. I've spoken about them before in this chamber, Mr. Speaker, and publicly in the media. Mr. Speaker, we've made significant investments, hundreds of millions of dollars into capital replacement projects, hundreds of millions of dollars into hiring more staff, Mr. Speaker, across this province. But we know there's more work to do, Mr. Speaker. We make improvements wherever necessary, and it's a continuous improvement program where we continue to review the operations of the Ministry of Health and look at where we're need to make some improvements and to make sure that we provide the best possible care for seniors in this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
To be clear, Mr. Speaker, the current Minister for Parks talked to over 400 seniors and was very clear. The call was for a seniors advocate or a seniors secretariat, something that this government failed to act on. Let's go to 2015. In response to the tragic death of Margaret Warholm, the member from Weyburn, the current Minister of Education, asked the Ombudsman to investigate. We know the recommendations that followed were not fully implemented. We also know that the former Minister of Health was fully aware of the infection risk of 4 bedrooms in long-term care, yet he did nothing. Will the Minister of Education take responsibility? Why didn't he make sure that all of those recommendations were followed?
I recognize the Minister of Seniors.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'll continue to talk about the past, I guess, for the member opposite. Mr. Speaker, in this year's budget, we've made some significant investments into seniors' care and seniors' issues. Mr. Speaker, it includes an increase in the seniors' income plan to a maximum of $360 per month, an over 33% increase. This past December, Mr. Speaker, and this is something we campaigned on in the election, we kept our promise to reduce ambulance fees for seniors. Full coverage is provided to seniors for air and ground ambulance costs for interfacility transfers within the province. We've also reduced the cost of ambulance transfers for seniors from $275 down to $135 as well, Mr. Speaker. That program also extends to the First Nations seniors in this province as well, Mr. Speaker. We've made enhancements to the seniors drug plan as well, Mr. Speaker. Funding for geriatric services in Regina, $700,000 there. $300,000, Mr. Speaker, for the Saskatchewan Seniors Mechanism. Those are just some of the investments this government has made. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I recognize the member from Saskatoon Eastview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's comical to hear the member opposite decry talking about the past when that's literally all that they want to do. The buck has to stop somewhere, and shuffling around the responsibility of Saskatchewan seniors like some kind of hot potato makes this government no less responsible for what goes on here. They've been in charge since 2007, and they bear responsibility for the state of senior care. In 2017, the auditor found affiliate and for-profit care home providers, including extended care, were not meeting current standards of care. She recommended then that this government start inspecting all long-term care homes in the province. And who did that recommendation go to? The current Minister for Sask Bills. Why didn't he act on it?
Recognize the Minister of Seniors.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There have been a number of recommendations from previous investigations that have been implemented by this government, dating back a number of years. Mr. Speaker, we take this issue very seriously, and when we receive these recommendations, we want to make sure that we follow through in them and improve care where necessary, Mr. Speaker. And I've spoken about some of these previously, a number of previous investigations by whether it's the Ombudsman or the Auditor, and the vast majority of those have been implemented. Mr. Speaker, there's one recommendation outstanding from the 2015 investigation by the Ombudsman, and work on that final recommendation is progressing. Mr. Speaker, the first part of the member's question, I think, talked about what this government has done or hasn't done, whatever his view is, Mr. Speaker. I think, Mr. Speaker, the people of this province they're happy to know that this government is a government that cares about long-term care in this province, Mr. Speaker, that they care about the care of senior citizens in Saskatchewan. Mr. Speaker, one of the things we announced in this budget was funding for the replacement of the Estevan nursing home, Mr. Speaker. And what did they say in the Estevan Mercury? Mr. Speaker, April 14th, Don Kindop, chair of the Nursing Home Committee, says, quote, "I'm ecstatic that the government has come forward and said that Estevan is now in the queue to start planning to replace the present nursing home. It's like spring after winter. It's a breath of fresh air and greenness and happiness," Kindop told the paper. Mr. Speaker, I guarantee you they weren't saying that when the NDP was in power. Yeah.
Ministerial Statements. I recognize the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have seen and heard the upsetting news out of India, where they have been struggling with massive numbers of people getting seriously ill and dying from COVID-19. This situation is critical, and we want to express our concern and deepest sympathies to the country and to our own Saskatchewan residents who are worried about their friends and family in India. But, Mr. Speaker, our government is doing more than extending our sympathy. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to announce that our government is donating 100 ventilators to India. The donation will include 30 critical care ventilators and 70 subacute ventilators. This donation will help provide critical resources to support care to the seriously ill in that country, which has been suffering greatly in the last few weeks. Mr. Speaker, this is a global pandemic, and we are pleased to be able to offer this support to a country in need during this difficult time. We are fortunate that we can make this donation while ensuring that our own residents continue to have access to all necessary medical equipment. Early in the pandemic, Saskatchewan proactively sourced several hundred additional ventilators, and we have thankfully had not been having to use any of these. Mr. Speaker, the Saskatchewan Health Authority will be packaging up and shipping the 100 ventilators as soon as possible. I believe we all share the desire to see India and its residents come through this safely and healthy as possible. We are gratified to be able to play a small part in their help. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Hear, hear.
Recognize the member from Saskatoon Fairview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the Minister for providing a copy of his response in advance. Of course, we've all seen devastating news coming out of India. I know the member for Regina Rosemont had a member statement quite recently about this as well, talking about some of that devastation and also indicating that the official opposition stands in solidarity with India as they're going through this very difficult time. And I know that the world is a lot more connected now than it ever was before, so we have the opportunity to see what other countries are going through, and that has also helped to shape our understanding of COVID as we've seen the actions that other governments are taking, but also how different countries have been hit, and as well as the studies and all of the science that's happening around the world to try and tackle this response. I know that many of our constituents and ourselves have friends and family that are in India, and it's terribly difficult for folks who are having to navigate those transcontinental relationships at this time and make sure that their family members are safe. We certainly need to be able to help each other out in these very difficult times. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we need a government that is going to be open and transparent with the people of this province, and be forthcoming with with modeling information about how COVID is impacting our province here, who is a government that is actively working on ramping up testing and contact tracing in addition to providing vaccines, because we know that that's not the only answer, Mr. Speaker. There is a lot more work that we can be doing on the home front, but we do appreciate this gesture, and we need to be able to make sure that everyone has the capacity to fight this deadly virus, particularly in light of what the variants are doing. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. I recognize the chair of the Standing Committee on the Economy.
Mr. Speaker, I am instructed by the Standing Committee on the Economy to report Bill number 30, the Saskatchewan Technology Startup Incentive Amendment Act 2021, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill be now read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 30 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 30 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on the Economy.
Mr. Speaker, I am instructed by the Standing Committee on the Economy to report Bill number 31, the Innovation Saskatchewan Amendment Act 2021, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister of Trade and Export Development.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and the bill be now read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 31 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may now proceed to move third reading.
I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 31 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You're probably going to get bored with me, but Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 5, the Business Corporations Act 2020, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read the third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 5 and that the bill be now read a third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 5 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 6, the Business Corporations Consequential Amendments Act 2020, a bilingual bill without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 6 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may now proceed to move third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 6 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 7, the Marriage Act 2020, a bilingual bill without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 7 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move the bill be now read a third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 7 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 8, the Marriage Consequential Amendment Act 2020, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in the Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 8 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may now proceed to move third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 8 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 9, the Miscellaneous Statutes Appeal Provisions Amendment Act 2020 with amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill and its amendments be now read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 9 and that the bill and its amendments be now read the third time. Is leave granted? When shall the amendments be read a first time?
The amendments be now read a first and second time.
It has been moved by the Minister that the amendments be now read a first and second time. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First and second reading of the amendments.
The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill now be read a third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 9 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 10, the Miscellaneous Statutes Appeal Provisions Amendment Act 2020, number 2, a bilingual bill with amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Justice Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill and its amendments be now read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 10 and that the bill and its amendments be now read the third time. Is leave granted? When shall the amendments be read a first time?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the amendments be now read a first and second time.
It has been moved by the Minister that the amendments be now read a first and second time. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First and second reading of the amendments.
The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that the Bill number 10 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 11, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2020, number 2, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 11 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read a third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 11 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 14, the Protection from Human Trafficking Act, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Chamber of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 14 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may now proceed to third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read a third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 14 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 15, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act 2020, with amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Justice Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill and its amendments be now read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 15 and that the bill and its amendments be now read the third time. Is leave granted? When shall the amendments be read a first time?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the amendments be now read a first and second time.
It has been moved by the Minister that the amendments be now read a first and second time. Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
First and second reading of the amendments.
The Minister may now proceed to move third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read a third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 15 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is it the pleasure of the Assembly, or is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 16, the Pond Property Recording Amendment Act 2020, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Justice Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read a third time.
I request the new minister.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 16 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 16 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 22, the Credit Union Amendment Act 2020, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 22 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read a third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 22 be now read and the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 23, the Emergency Planning Amendment Act 2020, without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Justice Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 23 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may now proceed to move third reading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 23 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Mr. Speaker, I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 26, the Police Serious Incident Response Team Amendment Act 2021 without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Minister of Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 26 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is leave granted? The Minister may proceed to move third reading.
Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that Bill number 26 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is it the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. I recognize the Chair of the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Glad the crowd is with me, finally. I'm instructed by the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice to report Bill number 27, the Summary Offences Procedure Amendment Act 2021 without amendment.
When shall this bill be considered in Committee of the Whole on Bills? I recognize the Justice Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I request leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on this bill and that the bill now be read a third time.
The Minister has requested leave to waive consideration in Committee of the Whole on Bill number 27 and that the bill be now read the third time. Is it leave granted? The Minister may now proceed to move third reading.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I move that the bill be now read the third time and passed under its title.
It has been moved by the Minister that the Bill number 27 be now read the third time and passed under its title. Is the Assembly ready for the question? Is the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion? Carried.
Third reading of this bill.
Third reading. Orders of the day.
Government orders, adjourned debates. Item number 1, resume debate in the second reading motion for Bill number 34, the Fuel Tax Amendment Act 2021. Ms. Bowes.
I recognize a member from Saskatoon Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to offer my comments and add my comments on behalf of the official opposition to Bill number 34, the Fuel Tax Amendment Act 2021. I thought about my niece who drives an electric vehicle. And I thought, thank goodness she does not live in Saskatchewan, because this would impact her. And I haven't really given much thought about electric vehicles. What I have thought about is my grandchildren and those that come behind. And I thought, what kind of a life do I want to leave my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren, and those that come behind? And I thought I want to be able to look at leaving a cleaner place for those. And I really believe that we have to look at leaving a better place for those ones that come behind us. And what are we doing today? So when this tax came for the electric vehicles, my first thought was, well, aren't these folks purchasing electricity when they plug their vehicles in all night? And are they not contributing that way? That was my first thought. Because when I've had chats with my niece about learning about electric vehicles, she would talk about having to charge her vehicle at night and how easy it was for her. And I thought, great. And she was quite proud to be driving an electric vehicle. And I think back home here in Saskatchewan, the $60,000 that's generated from this tax really isn't a whole lot of resources, considering the kind of roads, in particular, First Nation communities have that are provincial roads. Many of the roads that are provincially ought to be and should be maintained by the municipality, these provincial roads, are like washboards. And many communities that have loved ones, especially when it rains, and these roads are terrible, cannot properly drive on these roads and go and bury their families. So I think, the $60,000 is going to take a lot more to fix the roads that we use. And also, when I heard this, I thought, the government made an announcement that there was going to be some SGI rebates. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. You're going to give us money, and then you're going to tax these a small group of people. And I thought, you know what? In my opinion, give those people that are trying to look at the environment, give them that break. The rebate. We've been overcharged for how many years, and we're suddenly going to get a rebate. Use those dollars to maintain our roads. So those are things that I have given thought to, and I'm not a critic area. This isn't my critic portfolio. However, I thought I should and ought to say something, give my thoughts on this. And so with that, Mr. Speaker, I move that we adjourn debate on Bill number 34, the Fuel Tax Amendment Act of 2021. Miigwech.
The member has moved to adjourn debate. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. I recognize the Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. In order to facilitate the work of committee this afternoon and this evening, I move that this House do now adjourn.
The Government House Leader has moved to adjourn the House. It's a pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. This House now stands adjourned until 1:30 tomorrow.